Welcome. Welcome to Courageous Conversations. We are so glad you are here. I'm Jessica Green, and together with Reverend Dr. Zina Jacque and Claire Nelson, we welcome you to Courageous Conversations presented by Urban Consulate at Barrington's White House. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome two special guests, Derek Black and Matthew Stevenson, whose incredible story of befriending radical disagreement you may have read in the book Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Eli Saslow. Or you may have seen them in national media, on The Daily Show, The Today Show, PBS, NPR, and the list keeps going. A few years ago, they sat down to talk with our friend Krista Tippett at On Being, and that episode, by the same name, blew us away. Like us, Krista was interested in exploring the unlikely friendship that unfolded over a 2-year period between these two college students, Matthew, an Orthodox Jew, and Derek, who at the time was the heir apparent to the white power movement. Theirs truly is a fascinating story of building relationship across difference, and it absolutely blew me away when I read it. We're so excited for Derek and Matthew to be in conversation with us tonight, and if afterward you are eager for more, which I think you probably will be, we encourage listening to the On Being episode with Krista Tippett, which has inspired us here at Courageous Community since our inception. Derek Black is a PhD student in history at the University of Chicago, where he is examining how the legacy of the medieval European worldview influenced the development of ideas about race in the early modern Atlantic. Matthew Stevenson was born and raised in South Florida. He graduated from the New College of Florida with degrees in mathematics and economics. He holds an MBA from Columbia Business School and currentely works as an investment analyst at T. Rowe Price. Welcome, Matthew and Derek. Okay, so as you know how it goes usually for those of you who are here frequently, we have a bit of a different setup tonight. We thank you for your patience with our new hybrid, in-person, and virtual model, and for your understanding as we strive to gather safely during these COVID times. We are recording and live streaming tonight for those who can't be with us in the room, so a special hello to our Zoom audience. For friends here in the house, thank you for your cooperation and keeping noise to a minimum for the recording. If you're tuning in online, thank you for remaining muted. We're doing this a little differently tonight. So usually we break out into discussion groups after our presenters have had their time. This time, though, we wanted to allow space for you to be able to ask your questions to benefit from the wisdom of our guests while we have the opportunity. So here's how this will flow. During our conversation Zina and I will have with Derek and Matthew, please be thinking of any questions you'd like to ask. Use the cards on your seats, or type in the chat online for those of you who are online. We won't be reading the names of the question askers aloud, and we'll do our best to ask as many as we can. We'll take a short 5-minute pause to collect all those questions, and then we'll come back for about a 30-minute Q&A period. Then at the very end, we will come back together for closing words from Reverend Zina, as per usual. And then quickly before we begin our program tonight, we're delighted to partner with Volumes Book Cafe in Chicago on a pop-up shop that's downstairs in the first floor drawing room. And they are offering a curated collection of books and gifts to spread courage and kindness this season. The shop will be open second Wednesdays, 5 to 9 p.m. this fall. So please spread the word and invite your friends. In fact, the book about Derek's story is available for sale tonight. We also have a podcast, Becoming Courageous. There's a link on our homepage of our website to subscribe. And it's a great way for friends who can't make these sessions to listen in. Our newest episode with Dr. Krista Robinson-Lyles is about what we have to do in our minds and bodies and spirits to keep going with this work to build more inclusive communities even when it gets hard. You guys probably know a little bit about that. It's an episode Zina, Claire, and I all found very nourishing with great practical advice, and I suspect we will be returning to it many times to listen and re-listen. We could not produce this series without your ticket purchases and the generous support of our sponsors and donors. So we want to thank Barrington Area Community Foundation, BMO Wealth Management, Kim Duchessois, Tyler and Danielle Lenchuk, Kobe and Eric Struckmeyer, Young Chung, Susan and Rich Padula, Carol and David Nelson, Dennis Barsima, Julie Kanak, and Mike Regali, and a very special thank you tonight to the Illinois Holocaust Museum for their community partnership for tonight's session. Can you join me in thanking everyone? Phew, okay, that part's all done. It's my great pleasure to introduce Reverend Zina.
Oh, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to have you virtually and in the room. So whether you are at home or in this space, can I invite you just to shift in your seat? Just shift, get comfortable, get the line of sight that you want. Scoot your chair over if you need to. Maybe not at home, but here. Because shifting is good. Shifting puts you in touch with your body. Shifting gives you a sense of your being. And it gives you the right perspective, a new position. Shifting is good. And tonight, you are in the space of two gentlemen who have shifted. Shifted in their understanding, shifted in their thinking, shifted in the way they present in the world. We want to be in the presence of those who know how to shift. Because too often in our world, we become rigid in our positions and forget that learning and growing and shifting makes us more comfortable in our bodies, gives us a better line of sight. So come, get ready to shift, not just in your chairs, but in your souls. When Matthew invited Derek to a Shabbat dinner during their freshman year at New College in Florida, it set Derek on a path toward transformation, and I suspect Matthew as well. This understanding of shifting, of beliefs, of perspective, of the ways to show up in the world became real for all involved. So tonight, we come to ask some questions of Derek and Matthew and of all who have gathered. How can unlikely friendships open us up to shifts? How can unlikely friendships expand us? And what do we need to make that possible? Come, the evening shall begin. For those of you here tonight who may be unfamiliar with Derek and Matthew's story, travel back in time with me for just a moment. You two met in college, and before we ask you how you met, can you share who you were when you arrived on campus? What people and experiences from your childhood influenced you, shaped you, your worldview? Who were you when you arrived as undergraduates? Matthew, would you be willing to begin?
Sure. Is the mic on? Good. I was turning it on behind me, so hard to guarantee anything. I grew up in South Florida. I would say I had two really major influences on me when I was a child. The first was my mother, who was an alcoholic, and she got sober about the time I was 8 or 9. And I used to go with her to AA meetings, what they call open meetings, which is a meeting that you can attend even if you are not an alcoholic. And I got to know a lot of the people who were, well, I should say you can go if you're not an alcoholic, but you usually didn't have many 10-year-olds. It wasn't really the target audience. But I got to know many people who were in situations that were almost unfathomably difficult. Not only their present circumstances, but the psychic circumstances, the guilt about what they may have done in the past and harms that they may have wrought. But at the same time, I saw so many of these people somehow transform that pain and chaos to become forces of good and change and transformation in their own communities, and especially helping other people who are dealing with the same issues to not have to suffer like they had suffered. And that instilled in me, I think, very early on, the notion that people are not immutable, that just because a person is a certain way today, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the way that they are doomed to be in perpetuity. And then the second influence was my father, and together with my father started studying Kabbalah when I was 10 or 9, and I became involved when I was in my early teens, and became more and more involved in spirituality, and the central thread through that was a belief in the importance of human dignity, that even though I may disagree with people, even vehemently, about major issues, it doesn't give me the right to treat them as anything less than human.
In many ways, I was born into a legacy that I grew into as I aged. Because when I was born, my family, my parents especially, but some my siblings and also everyone who was important in their lives had already spent nearly 30 years building the white nationalist movement from the ground up. That both of my parents had come into that movement when they were teenagers. They had been born in relatively average, normal, middle class, sort of comfortable lifestyles, and yet they had gotten into this ideology by both their own interests and pursuits, and then by also finding the people who were building this prototypical thing in the 1960s. They had sent away for books. They had signed up for newsletters. They had gone on carpools to events to try to meet the other people who were as fundamentally worried about the future in a way that I think we don't always recognize, this perspective of this like apocalyptic view that the world is going to end if they don't do something. And everyone around them didn't feel that way. Everyone around them typically, I think, felt fairly casually racist. My father grew up in 1960s Alabama in a white family. My mother grew up in South Florida, which was still segregated at the time. Both of them grew up among casual white racism, but everyone in their family told them that they were overreacting by joining Klan organizations and allying with Nazis, and yet they saw that as the only route that was appropriate to the beliefs that they built when they were teenagers, and so they built a movement. They looked around and they saw the end of the civil rights movement, and they didn't see what their response was from their side, from the people who agreed with them. And so they went and pieced it all together. They found different organizations that hated each other. They brought them into one umbrella. They formed organizations. They built a political platform. They allied with different partisans. They ran campaigns for themselves. And they had accomplished a lot of things. They had built their lives in a way that this ideology and this worldview of the fact that they had to act or else things were doomed was already central to their lives. And I was born very late in both of my parents' lives. My mother was in her late 40s when I was born. And both of them had come together pretty late in life. They had known each other from the white nationalist movement, but they had not been in a relationship until later in life. And so what I was born into was something kind of like the tail end of what they had been trying to accomplish. And so when I was about 9 or 10, my dad started taking me on trips around the country to meet the people that he had formed these alliances with throughout his whole life. And I met the older generation, people who had been mayors and sheriffs and county commissioners in towns, not just in the South, but across the country, who had combated the civil rights movement. And I heard these stories from the police officers who arrested Rosa Parks on the bus and like what that day was like. I heard stories from politicians who had tried to challenge Martin Luther King marches, and from these old men in restaurants who felt like they had been the progenitors of something that my family was now carrying on and that I was supposed to pick up the pieces. As I grew and I became more knowledgeable and aware, I went to their lectures. I saw professors who were tenured at their own universities lecture about why they believed race was this biological construct, why they thought segregation was essential for society. And I learned all the history and I learned all the advocacy of this movement, and I accepted the mantle that I would figure out how to extend this into the future. It was always a real mix of people who thought that everything was doomed on one hand, that they could never win, that they would keep struggling like this, but they would never win. And people who had this like from their perspective, optimistic view that they had a movement that could change the world if they just kept at it. And that was the legacy that I took upon myself when I was a teenager.
So Derek, growing up into a legacy such as that, you took it on as you being the next torchbearer, right, for this purpose and for this cause. Tell me a little bit about family life at home with regards to, you didn't go to school, you were homeschooled, is that correct?
I went to school up until 3rd grade, and then afterwards I was homeschooled.
And so can you tell me a little bit about the decision behind that? Was that your choice?
I was 9 years old, and so the aspects of choice, when I was, they did ask me. I think that's important. Like there's no aspect of my upbringing that my parents didn't try to make sure that I was opting in. And when I think back to almost every decision, I was essentially an only child, because I was the only young child in the home, and I was my parents' only child. And when they chose preschools, I remember being whatever age, 3 or 4, and going around all the schools and them sitting me down and asking which one did you like the most. When I went to public schools after that, once I finished 3rd grade, they sat me down and asked me if I would like to be homeschooled rather than going into the 4th grade. And I answered, yes, that sounds wonderful. I don't have to go to school anymore. And it was a strange upbringing after that point, but I never felt like I was never being forced to do anything that I didn't want to do. When I started giving these interviews to national and international news, my dad would ask each time, are you comfortable doing this? And I would often say, no, I don't want to do this one. There would be maybe a story that would make me feel like bad, because they're all bad coverage. But even at this young age, I felt like we were right and we knew this right thing, but no one else did. And everybody had this sense that they were righteous in this way that needed to persevere despite how it made you feel to be portrayed that way. But if a story was especially bad, I would stop for a while. I would say, I don't want to I don't want to be portrayed this way anymore, and I'd stop for a year or two, and then I'd come back to it. And when I'd give these interviews when I was 12 or 13 or 14, my dad would always leave the room to make sure that I didn't feel like he was monitoring what I had to say, that he said he wanted me to just be fully honest and say whatever it is that I thought was the thing to say. And then he'd come back when the interview was done. And I think that's an important thing, that it tells you something about the relationship that I had with my family. It wasn't one that was demanding exactly. Like there's a lot of expectation for this movement where people thought they may be the generation that it fizzles, something that they had built, and they really thought that maybe they were just going to lose, that this was a losing battle. And so there's a lot of demand and expectation that somebody carry it on, but it was also always made very clear that that's a burden that we can't ask of you. And I think those two things, like feeling like I am voluntarily taking on a burden for a cause that my family has given these things up for, was the feeling of being almost like valiant, right? Like that was the feeling within this movement.
So how'd you get to college?
They actually made me initially. I wanted to, I finished this homeschooling thing, which was very strange and self-directed and I was a reader and a studier, but I decided what I was going to study. When I realized I wanted to know more about English literature, I just had them order the collected Norton anthology, and I just read every volume of it without any context. And that's the sort of weird education that I had. And so I got to be 18, and I said, well, I like studying, I like learning, I'm going to continue learning, but I don't know why I would need anything formal. I never have had anything formal. And so my mother made me go to college initially. I had gone on some kind of trip, and when I got back, she picked me up at the airport, and instead of taking me home, she dropped me off at the placement exams at the community college. And so I did it, and I learned. I'm still completing a PhD, so clearly I liked it, but I did it somewhat under duress. And then I learned that I really liked learning in a formal, structured way from experts, and that what I'd been missing was people who could contextualize things. And the first 2 years were a community college, and it was the same time that I was running for local office. I was going to college, beginning college, at the same time that I was coming into the greatest amount of notoriety that I had ever had. That I had run for office and won this local county seat. I had been in the New York Times. I was just widely recognized in South Florida. I would go out and people would like know my face. People would respond in whatever way. And I was known as a white nationalist who had championed these opinions and was trying to advocate them in a way that mainstream people recognize, to try to demonstrate that white nationalists could win in the same year that Barack Obama was running for president. And the response I got was, you may expect, it's a lot really negative, and that was not actually the case. I could not go out without somebody coming up and congratulating me, some random stranger congratulating me just every day, many times a day, for months. And that was the same context where I finished the community college and needed to have the next part of my degree. And I looked around and found this liberal arts college that was the honors college of the State University system of Florida. And it was the only place I applied to. I was still very cavalier about education at that point, and I applied because I wanted their medieval program, and I wanted the quirky education that they provided, and I wanted to be about 3 hours away from home, where I would be outside of my home for the first time. And I did not think anything really was going to change about my life when I went there.
Little did you know.
That's true.
So on campus, rumor has it that you were in the same dorm.
Yes.
And I did hear some kind of a story that you used to sing some of your country western music, and Matthew didn't really think it was very good. Is that correct?
No, it's the opposite. I was the singer who he didn't think was.
Oh, okay. Well, correct.
I never
me.
critiqued.
So tell us about how you met exactly on campus. And my question for you is, contextualize for us a little bit about what campus life was like for you, and which came first, the friendship or the conversations?
I can start, I suppose. So Derek, the dormitory, the doors all open to the outside, essentially. So he lived downstairs from me, but if I opened my front door, I basically could look down at his front door. And I knew him around because he, amongst other things, as you mentioned, he, as a hobby, would play guitar in the sort of common areas on the table or whatever. And so I liked a lot of that music and would go out and either listen or sing along. And so I knew him in that context. We took a class together our first semester at the school. We, that Halloween of that fall, I think we watched Zombieland in your dorm room. Yeah. So.
You were scared.
Yeah, that's about as scary of a movie as I can take. And so we had interactions and we knew each other, but first of all, I had no idea about his background. He mentioned his notoriety, but that did not extend to the campus at that point. No one knew. And we were not close. I mean, I had a group of friends who I was very close with, and he was not a core part of that group. So we became sort of friendly without being, close friends.
Yeah, I think the way that we got each other's numbers was because we were in the same class and we traded study guides at the end of the semester.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And Matthew, you were hosting Shabbat dinners on
Yes.
campus already.
Yes. From the time I basically arrived, there was not really a Jewish infrastructure at the school. And so I started hosting every Friday night Shabbat dinners for whoever wanted to join, whether Jewish or not Jewish, religious or atheist, whatever. Everyone was more than welcome. And over time, it grew from me and one friend to maybe a dozen people, something along those lines on a regular basis. So it was still a relatively small group, but more than two.
At some point, though, you became aware that Derek had this history, this philosophy, that he was born into this legacy.
Yes.
And was a self-defined white nationalist. You learned that, and you invited him
Yes.
to the Shabbat dinner. My question is, you had, sorry, that's a statement, that's not a question. My question is, how did you suspend what could have been judgment? How did you remain curious enough to invite this person who would say that your ancestors were at the base of what he viewed as anti-American, as wrong? How did you suspend judgment? How did you stay curious? Was there a cost that you paid? Why'd you do this, Matthew?
Sure. So I would say, first of all, that I would not characterize myself as, although I was curious, that was not really the motivation. In fact, before Derek came the first Shabbat, first of all, I told people who were going to be there that he was coming. I didn't want them to be surprised. And secondly, I told them not to bring up white nationalism or race, because I felt that had someone, it wasn't like we were the first people who were going to tell him that white nationalism isn't such a nice thing. He'd heard it before, and he'd spent his whole life defending that ideology. Frankly, I haven't spent my whole life dismantling, the arguments of that ideology. I didn't have an argument that I could give him in a pithy sentence that would make him abandon his life's work. But I also felt like he'd grown up around this environment. His parents, as he mentioned, were committed and extremely ardent members of that world. If just looking at my own parents and how they affected me, if they had been involved in that way with that kind of an organization or that kind of a movement, I could easily imagine myself being influenced by that. So, and not only that, but I have to imagine that they didn't have as many opportunities maybe in the black household growing up to interact with the kinds of people that the white nationalist ideology despises. And if we didn't provide that opportunity then at the university, that there may never be another opportunity, because he would graduate and he would be back working within that white nationalist umbrella, and the die would be cast. So I felt like I had a responsibility to Derek and to myself, frankly, to invite him.
What was the responsibility to yours? I can see the responsibility conceivably to Derek. What was the responsibility to yourself?
If I have an opportunity that's presenting itself to do maybe something good in the world, then I have an obligation and a responsibility to see it through. I can't just pass the buck.
Did you have doubts? Because I'm assuming some of the guests at the Shabbat dinner disagreed with your position.
I think all of them disagreed with my position. And most of them stopped coming. So they voted with their feet. Yeah, including I have a roommate, for example, who came every week in a suite, so we had different bedrooms, we shared a dining area, a kitchen. And she would stay in her room until Derek left because she didn't want anything to do with him. And she was my roommate, so it was awkward. But for many people, they just stopped coming. And in some cases, voiced their belief that I was essentially giving a safe space to white nationalism.
So you were giving a safe space to Derek, who had...
I'm not sure I would characterize, that weren't my words, Did
you feel safe?
It's an interesting question, right? That the first time I came, I thought there was going to be a big fight. Because the context was that I had spent a semester where nobody knew my activism. I was still participating in a daily radio show for that semester, but it was early in the morning, and it was before most of my friends woke up. And I would go do that, and I was beginning to see that there is going to be an explosion here, because I'd been in lots of contexts where people saw me on the news eventually, but because we were in some other context, they would just let it slide. I would be I had lots of hobbies, I had lots of activities and extracurriculars and things. And in all of those circumstances, people would say, they maybe challenge me on it. They would say, white nationalism is horrible, why would you believe that? And I would just make it clear that I didn't want to bring that to this context. I didn't want to talk about it. And we just focused on what we had in common. And it was really clear that this was a community where I think although most members are that same sort of, I just don't want to be involved in this, it was not an acceptable response for the community to make, because it had committed itself to social justice and racial justice. And so when people found out it was going to be explosive, and I had developed all these relationships with people who I was actually very close to, who were going to feel betrayed when that happened. And that's exactly what happened. I got outed on campus. I watched those relationships implode because I was studying abroad the second semester. And I came back to a context where Matthew invited me to a dinner within the first couple weeks, I think, of being back. And I was busy trying to find off-campus housing because they had mysteriously, without explaining, the school had given me an exemption to not live in the dorms at the last second after this happened, without saying why they were doing that. And so I found...
Do we know why?
Yeah. So I found this apartment off campus, and I had tried showing up to like social gatherings, and people had surrounded me. Like, people had surrounded me late at night at one of the parties, and I had to, another person who was actually one of your suite mates later on, like, pulled me out of the situation and got me out of the party. And it was very hostile and very clear that there was not a social scene for me there. And I looked for other things. I found, hobbies in the community and community groups. And Matthew's invitation was the first invitation I got to do anything. And we knew each other a bit. We had, traded study guides, and, you would come down when I was playing music, but we weren't like great friends. And so I came and I expected it to be kind of a fight. And in a way, I thought that almost might be familiar. I was used to believing that I was righteous and I knew the right things and I knew how to argue, and I conducted seminars where I taught people how to like talk to the media and how to debate and do this kind of stuff. And so if there had been a big fight, that would have been pretty natural. I would have not had, I would have not been coming back the next time, but that's what I thought was going to happen. And when it didn't happen, and I came back the next week, and the week after that is when things got uncomfortable in a way that I had not anticipated. I knew how to have a fight. I didn't really know how to sit with attending a Shabbat dinner every week.
I don't know how to attend a Shabbat dinner either, so I'd love to come sometime. So I'm really interested in the juxtaposition of the outrage and the social kind of outcasting that was done on campus, and the opposite that happened with you, that was a disarming moment for you, where you were being invited into conversation and dinner and friendship, and how that played into this shift that eventually happened for you. I also am very curious to understand what it was that you guys first started to talk about at dinner. I mean, you came in ready to be able to argue and defend some of your ideological beliefs, but it sounds like you didn't have to do that for a while.
Right. The experience, I don't know exactly the timelines, because it never became a confrontation of the Shabbats. They continued to the end without ever confronting it was people I met at these dinners who took me aside outside of the context, outside of this like bubble of the dinners themselves, and started approaching me with questions like, you're attending these dinners regularly. You would say, yes, you're close friends with a lot of the people at these things. And you would also say that you are committed to an ideology that says a lot of them don't belong in the country. Would you say that you're committed to these things? And those conversations started with the question of, am I willing to talk about it? Because nobody on campus was talking about it. And my answer was yes. And then the second question is, why do you believe this? This seems discordant with these relationships. And my answers were all sort of like pseudoscientific and rational, and they weren't feeling based. They were, I believe this for all these reasons, and I can argue them, I can tell you them, and we can debate them. And what proceeded were several years with this person who is now, full disclosure, my spouse, who was the roommate who locked herself in her bedroom for weeks. It was a rocky start, but like. And those conversations, like, I think that's one of the spaces where it becomes mysterious to me, that I didn't go into conversations like that. I didn't go to the college, I didn't go to the Shabbat dinners, I didn't go into these conversations where I was willing to explain myself thinking that I would change. I wasn't trying to change. I thought I was correct, but I also thought I was somebody who would listen, even though I hadn't up until that point. Like Matthew said, it's not the first time that people had said white nationalism is wrong. It was the first time that I had listened to it, and that is because I was now in a space where I knew the people who were saying either to me or in the public forum that I was harming them, that I could justify it and say that maybe what they think they understand is what's harming them. And because my original questions were, where's the misunderstanding? Because my family had always said and believed that they do not advocate violence, they condemn violence. And so if people felt unsafe, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was the media, maybe it was things, the portrayals. And those were the initial conversations. They weren't ones where I was asking, tell me why I'm wrong, I'd like to change my mind. It was, let me explain myself to you.
There is this powerful moment that you've just described when you were ready to listen. What shift occurred? You've got, I'm making this up, you've got half the campus yelling at you, and you've got a portion of the campus sitting at dinner with you. There are, I'm going to choose the word, intimate conversations with people that you are beginning to appreciate, who are challenging. So there's this roar and there's this quiet. There's this befriending and there's this challenge, all in the midst of dinner. How did that position you to listen?
I'm not sure that it had to. I think there's an essential part that there is. It's almost the uncertain thing about my experience that I feel the most uncomfortable with, that there's a sense maybe of inevitability. And I actually, not to be the one who asks questions, but I would like to plant the seed. I think Matthew's experience of not always knowing where this is going is something that I have trouble myself sitting with, imagining the experience. Because I at least always knew what I was thinking, sort of, and you didn't always.
Never. In fact, I never knew what he was thinking.
But you were playing this pivotal role in making this happen. And there's no guarantee that being in a situation where I felt like I was incredibly under fire and being condemned and having people who I, most of the time didn't particularly care about me as an individual were condemning me in very public ways in this space. My initial reaction to that when I first got back, in addition to going to the Shabbat dinner, was to organize a seminar out of state where I tried to bring white nationalists together and teach them how to run for office and talk to the media and do all the things that activists do, because that was a space where I was respected and known, and where the people who I'd always been close to could come together and reinforce each other. And there's no necessary, even for myself, there's no necessary reason why I couldn't just lean into that kind of comfort. That the reality that I did listen took such nuanced, careful planning, actually in sacrifice on the behalf of other people, that I think it's the part about this that I still feel the most uncertainty when I think about, that had I experienced different things and how other people not reacted the way they did, what choices would I have made? I don't have full confidence in myself. That we can talk a little bit more about the fact that I believe that our choices are mediated by the people we respect and care about and feel obligated to. And that's the shift that didn't necessarily need to happen. Had I stayed obligated to this community that my family had built for decades, it would have been the more likely outcome. In many ways, I think the fact that I ultimately felt like I had to make the choice of admitting my obligation to people who were outside of that community, and therefore having to disavow the harm that my old community was causing, was the most difficult choice, and it was not one that is the most likely, I think. It's not the one that happens most of the time.
Why did you stick with this when you didn't know where it was going, Matthew?
Well, it was difficult. I won't lie. It was difficult because it wasn't as though he came for a dinner and then there was the end of it. I mean, it was 2 years, basically, week after week. And not only at some point, it was more than just Friday nights. We were spending a lot of time because he didn't live on campus. So if he was on the campus, he'd usually be with me. And you asked me earlier about the curiosity. I never once asked Derek about what he believed. And so for 2 years, I had no idea what he believed. I mean, I knew some broad strokes maybe about what he had once believed, but what he believed on an ongoing basis, I couldn't ascertain without asking him, and I felt like asking him might throw a wrench into the gears of the whole thing. And I wasn't willing to do that just to satisfy my curiosity. Why? Just keep going. There's a parable that I like a lot, which influenced me a lot then, and which I remember from my youth, which is Prince is born and he has all the luxuries in the palace, but eventually the luxuries and the pleasures, they stop giving a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment. And at the entrance to the palace, there's a giant rock. And he prays and he prays and he prays, and amazingly, God answers him. He asks God, what should I do with my life? And God says, your job in this world is to push the rock. And so, of course, most people pray and they don't hear anything, so it's very exciting that he heard. And so he goes and he's sweating and he's pushing and he's all his efforts. But obviously it's a huge boulder. I mean, he's a human being. It doesn't move. And the next day, he does a little bit less and a little bit less, until eventually in the morning he puts his little finger on the rock and he goes about the day like he would have anyway. And eventually, of course, he leaves the world like everyone, and he's told he failed. And he says, what do you mean? How did I fail? Every single day since we had that conversation, I was pushing that rock. But it never moved, What am I supposed to do? And the Creator says, your job is to push the rock. My job is to move the rock. So I think the fact that something is not borne fruit yet doesn't mean that it's not going to. Maybe it's just not ripe yet.
I'm not following that up.
Oh, you're the Reverend.
I'm not following that up.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you for that. So I'm curious, Matthew, who was there to support you through these 2 years of building a friendship with Derek, but also being in relationship with someone who you knew believed in things that were opposite to who you were as a human? Did you have support? Who did you go to? Where did you go?
My idea of consultation as a general rule is to look in the mirror and ask myself, so I don't know that I had a lot of, I wasn't looking for guidance or approval, to what to do. There was one guy who was very close with me, Moshe Ash, who was the person who I originally was starting to do the Shabbat dinners with, and he and I together sort of invited Derek the first time, and so he and I were he was my most consistent source of support in that regard. And my parents also, to an extent, not on a daily basis, but they were aware of what was going on. I would say also, it wasn't as though I was naive about the effects of anti-Semitism. I remember being, for example, I started wearing the funny hat, the kippah, when I was about 12, and on a regular basis. And I remember I went to Italy shortly after that, and I remember right outside the Leaning Tower, being chased around the Square of Miracles there by a group of teenagers, spat on and attacked, in other words. So, and unfortunately, this kind of thing happened many times afterwards. So it's not just an abstract thing I read about in a book. I mean, I've been personally physically attacked, had to run, etc. But it doesn't matter, the fact that you maybe have had a negative experience like that, it can either make you afraid or it can give you enthusiasm or a certain amount of excitement, feeling that what you're doing maybe actually has more of an impact on the world. And so I think that's true of any experience that we have, that we can have an impression from it which just makes us freeze, and we can have, and it's a conscious choice, but a choice to make it so that it actually gives us more fuel for whatever purpose we have in our lives.
I'm really curious, Derek, about the point where you got to this place of conflict, where you were in relationship and in conversation and understanding white nationalism and the data and the facts that you really believed in and were using to argue your understanding of it. And at what point it became clear to you that that data wasn't accurate, or it wasn't being used how you felt was, had integrity? What did that conflict look like for you?
It was incremental, that it never felt really until I was at the precipice of what do I do? How do I feel? Do I have to condemn this? What do I do about this? Every moment along the way was a separate piece of information that I felt like I had a worldview that didn't rest on any one piece of evidence, but that had many factors and that had many arguments, and that if I was a person who believed what I believed about humanity, which is the beliefs of white nationalism is that race is the building blocks of humanity, that it's inherited and genetic, it can be clearly defined, and on top of this, a deeply anti-Semitic worldview that the world is being moved by this anti-Semitic conspiracy. And those two beliefs were what I was inculcated with. They were what I believed was true as a teenager, and they weren't something that I just felt with no evidence. I felt like there was lots of different reasons for it. And so anti-Semitism seemed the most unreal to me the earliest. And I don't know if that's unique to me. I don't know if it's my personal experience, but it was something like Holocaust denial was something that's inherent in white nationalism. And fairly early in my college career, before I was even outed, it was something that I had leaned more into my skepticism of that and did research. And it's just so well documented that it seemed ignorant in a way that I didn't talk to my family about. It was, in retrospect, it was the earliest thing that was a rift between us, and I didn't talk to them about it because I wanted to just resolve it for myself. I wanted to believe that I did not have to be fully in conference with everything that my family believed, while I could still be a white nationalist who had a worldview, who wanted to advance it, but had quibbles and qualms. Like, there was ways of believing most of it, but not all of it. And that was a path that led down different roads that I didn't see at the time. And every piece of evidence on these racial beliefs, they believe that IQ is something that's predicted on race. They believe that crime is something that's predicted on race. And there are ways that you can misuse statistics to try to believe that. There are conferences. White nationalists have academic conferences where they have people who have tenureships at real universities who go and make these arguments. And I felt like I was well supported there until I started having conversations where I would say, here's the evidence that I believe justifies my worldview, and one by one we'd look at more studies and I'd see how the statistics are being misused and abandoned, and I would come back a month or so later and say, I don't want to be using bad evidence. But each thing like that didn't take away my whole worldview. I could be somebody who wasn't going to use a bad piece of evidence without thinking that everything was undermined. And that experience went and continued up until I had to really take stock of, if none of the evidence is true, then what is left, and have to face that it's the community, it's the people who I feel indebted to, who raised me, who were my babysitters, who told me their stories, who expected me to carry on their legacy. And if I didn't think it was true, and on top of that, I had recognized over years how it was not a misunderstanding. It was actively harming, for very rational reasons, people who I was close to, who I had within my world, that I was just left with, what is the obligation then? What is the action that I have to do there? But there was never a moment along the way where, yes, obviously this is leading to me completely fundamentally changing everything I believe. It always felt like a piece, trying to be more consistent with my values of being evidence-driven, but not feeling like that would undermine everything.
And now you call yourself an unexpected advocate for anti-racism. Those are your words that describe you. We, in terms of building courageous community here, often quote Churchill and say that courage is knowing when to stand up and speak, and it is knowing when to sit down and listen. The story you and Matthew tell about sitting down to listen is breathtaking. The patience that it took years, the not poking at questions, but being in relationship, radical friendship, the sit down and listen we've heard. What about this stand up and speak? How has that affected you and your family? How has that shifted your space in the world? That half of courage that is, what's it like to be an inside agitator?
It was something that took me many years to feel in any way willing to do. When I look back on this experience in college, I think people often ask about the question of, you looked at real facts, you were willing to come out of a worldview that was not fact-based and accept facts. And that was difficult, but it was not anywhere comparable to the devastation of leaving a community. Like making the decision that I needed, that I had an obligation to publicly condemn white nationalism was exactly the same thing as severing ties with my relations for the first 2 decades. And it was only like when I actually faced that I realized that this is the devastating choice, and I felt obligated to make it, but that I then wanted that to be enough. I wrote a public letter. I listed, here's what white nationalists believe, here's what is wrong with what white nationalists believe, and I'm gonna stop talking now. And I did for about 3 years. I spent about 3 years thinking that I couldn't necessarily escape it. I didn't feel like I could escape it, but that I at least had an obligation to do no more harm, to try to figure out a way to not do harm, until it got to a point where I realized something that in some ways, in like maybe perverse ways, my family had always realized, that it's not a value to not do something. It's not value-driven behavior to try to not hurt anything. That is just inaction. That is just you abdicating whatever responsibilities you have to other people. And that was the conversation where I like very slowly became more comfortable with, if white nationalism exists, if there is advocacy that I contributed to that still resounds in the world and still causes effects and still persuades people, the only way that you counter that is by speaking against it, by working against it, by working with people who have organizations against it, by trying to view the way that our society often emboldens it and try to challenge those points. And that is really the obligation, not unique to me, but it's an obligation that we all have to figure out who are the people who we feel obligated to, and what is the point that we can contribute in some way. And I still don't always have an answer to that, but it is at least clear that abdicating responsibility, being silent, is not doing that. Choosing to not harm something is that inaction is a decision you're making that has consequences.
Matthew, in your community, I'm assuming you had to do some defense of your friendship. How are you an inside voice to tell your community, however you define your community, that this is good work, this is important work?
First of all, I suppose that in the moment, I didn't feel like it was my job to convince anyone, really, including Derek, of anything. I was doing what I thought was right, and I felt and I continue to feel like when you see something that you think is right, and of course, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? There are plenty of people who have, you know, they think that they're right, but I don't think that external validation is the determining factor. At the same time, it's definitely the case that there were people who I explained myself to, largely in the same way I've explained this evening. It was not in any way an endorsement of his ideology. Needless to say, I was not white nationalist, but at the same time, I also wasn't trying to trick Derek or try to even convince him of anything. It was to give him an option. He sees what these people are like, Jews and people of color and so forth. Now he can make up his own mind what he wants to believe as an adult. And I feel like over time, people became more, certainly there are many people who are doing, as Derek mentioned, more confrontational work, for lack of a better word, and that does not at all say that one side is right or wrong. It's just different parts of a symbiotic, not necessarily coordinated, but sort of symbiotic relationship. So I don't necessarily think that I had to convince everyone that my approach was the best. It was an approach that was maybe one that I was uniquely situated for because of my identity. I could sort of extend an olive branch in a certain sense without it being accommodative to hate. And at the same time, there were others who had different backgrounds on the campus who I think seized whatever opportunities they felt presented themselves to them. Everyone's opportunities and circumstances are different, but I think we have to be aware of them and act accordingly.
You pushed the rock and the
Sure.
universe moved it.
Sure.
Speaking of the universe, what is the universal ingredient, do you feel, that is needed in order to have relationships like this? If there is one ingredient that is always present, because I'm imagining that your experience is not directly transferable. We all are having relationships in the unique time and space. You were college students, you know, who knows if this would have been possible, you know, at the ripe old age of 45, who knows? But is there one universal ingredient that you believe is always present when you're bridge building?
I'll let Derek take the first tack at this.
Yeah. My answer is a little bit with the caveat to it that it's almost sort of an answer to a different question that I get kind of often asked, which is, oh, you know, there's somebody in my life who I really feel like is harming people in our community, just not explicit, but like their beliefs are harmful to other people in our community, and I would really like to change that. And they're like, how do I do that? And I said that is not, there's no guidebook to this, and that it requires both ends be complicit in that process. It's not necessarily the case that both people or the person you're, you know, trying to change have to come into this with I would almost say they cannot possibly come into it saying, I'm gonna change here. Like that's, because that is not how this would ever work. But the ingredient that has to be present, if anything is ever going to happen, is that the relationship has to be in good faith, and there has to be mutual care and trust. That if you're going to ultimately persuade anyone, the almost warning that I feel like I have to give is that if you're entering that space with this goal of persuading, that it's not that it's doomed because you're trying to persuade somebody. Like, you can always be trying to persuade someone, but the only way you're ever going to be possibly heard is that you have to understand how they see it themselves. You have to be able to articulate back to them exactly what they believe in the way that they would say it. And if we're talking about something that dehumanizes you, then it's a very difficult thing that you're proposing. But that you cannot be persuaded by someone who you do not believe understands what it is you think and why you think it. And that's, I think, the ingredient that's there, that if we're talking about a relationship that really could be transformative, it has to be mutual. That it can't be that I'm approaching you because there's something that you truly fundamentally believe and I'm going to change your mind about that. And like, why would that work? We have to be in some sort of proximity. We have to be in some sort of closeness that is something that's bigger than I'm going to change your mind. Like, there's a place for that, and that's called activism, but it's not a relationship that transforms.
I think that the only thing I would add to that is I think that humility is very important, because if you come into it thinking that you're so smart and you're such a good person and this other person is almost a stereotypical villain. And I see so many times people maligning other people's intentions. Even, I mean, needless to say, white nationalism is a fairly extreme case, but there are plenty of people I know who I'll see on Facebook or other things, I think with a great sincerity, thinking that other people, claiming that other people, because of whatever political beliefs or other kind of beliefs, are somehow trying to damage the world, trying to destroy things, trying to hurt things. Why would a person with a rational mind ever behave this way? But if, like what Derek said, if I come into a relationship thinking this, there's no way for any kind of a personal friendship to blossom, because, I mean, needless to say, imagine if you started a friendship like that on any other grounds, you know, it's a disaster. So humility is the most important thing in this kind of relationship, or probably many others.
We have come close to the 8 o'clock hour. Jess, is there a question you want to ask before we take a little break and have time for people to write their questions?
I think my main question right now would be, what gives you hope? And we'll start with what gives you hope.
Yes.
I mean, my answer to that is with the explanation that I am typically trying to keep myself from being pessimistic, because I think that something that I alluded to earlier, this like uncertainty about the fact that there's no guarantee that I was going to go to college and, you know, learn the truth, because that's not how relationships always work, is my belief that most of the time people do not change the fundamental building blocks of themselves. It would be very, very strange if we did. If you know, it was possible that tomorrow you're going to believe something fundamentally different and your friends are going to be shocked. That happens very rarely. But that it can be hopeful in the sense that humans are radically transforming all the time, even given that we are very stable in our beliefs, very stable in our relationships, which is a consequence. Like, these are very connected concepts, that we are very stable in our identities, because our identity is our way of relating to our community, and that's the most important thing to most people. Within that context, within that jostling, there's enormous space for slow changes and big changes, and you see it all the time. It happens over time. Sometimes it happens very rapidly. Sometimes it happens over decades, but there's nothing that is set. There's nothing in our dynamics that will never change, can never change, even if it's something that has consistency over centuries or, you know, millennia sometimes. There's nothing that we cannot change on, and that the way we change is by our relationships with other people, which is to say that we all have the power to make that happen. We all have the power, by leaning into our relationships, to cause this transformation. And we're doing it all the time, even if we don't recognize it. And I find that hopeful.
I think that any study of you know, it's so easy to get caught up, if you're looking at the daily news, with one tragedy after the other. And it's easy to lose sight in that of how far the world has come over not just these generations, but centuries. And when I look around, whether at Derek or so many people I've known through AA, other groups, that even on an individual level, there's really no point of no redemption.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Friends, you have cards in your seats here. You have the chat function if you're with us online. We're going to take a 5-minute stretch break. We're really just going to stand up and stretch. And at that time, during this time, we are going to collect your questions or read them from the chat. Would you join me before you disperse in thanking Matthew and Derek for this extraordinary moment? So stand up, take a break, and in 5 minutes we'll come back for the Q&A. Can you just offer another round of applause? This is an amazing night. So Derek, first question. We are in a pretty charged national conversation right now about teaching American history. With lawmakers weighing in on what can and cannot be taught, what do you think is being legislated now in this moment? What happens if inclusive history is not taught?
I mean, if I should reiterate that I am doing a PhD in history, and I'm deeply embedded in the idea of the study of history and the analysis of it, and I know why it happens, because I came from an activist family who were primarily interested in strategically moving society in ways that they wanted it to be moved. But I'm disappointed when we talk about history as if it is fact or fiction, or if it necessarily reflects the culture we want or the values we want, because history is not something that has any one answer to it. It's really a collection of things, and we bring ourselves into it. We bring our expectations, we bring our analysis, and we reinterpret it constantly. And I think that's the obvious context for when we have these debates about how are we going to teach history. It's not a question of you're teaching lies or you're teaching, true things, or you're denigrating someone. It's really a question of who are we serving, and what are the values that we're advocating, and what is guiding us. And then that's the reason why this is so contentious to begin with, that people try to simplify it down into, I'm going to teach facts, or I'm going to teach not facts, or you're going to bring your agenda into it. And there is nothing about history that is not, I don't want to say agenda, that is not reflecting who we are. That we are not looking at people from the past and trying to bring them up like a crystal. We are bringing ourselves into a context that is outside of our present and trying to analyze who we are right now, and which is why this is incredibly contentious, and it is why the question brings me back to the answer that I have for almost all decisions, which is, who am I obligated to? Like, who is within this universe? And I don't mean that factionally. I mean it as in, there's an exercise that comes out of sociology called the universe of obligation, where we expand out. We start with the question of who is our most intimate people, who is closest to us, who do we feel the most responsibility for, your closest friends, your family, your spouse, and you keep going out circle by circle. And if you do this exercise with a very open heart, you recognize that there's no person who you cannot get out to where you recognize your responsibility, your connection, your obligation to them. And I think that's the value that I try to sit with myself when I'm trying to make a decision. And I think it's the value you have to bring to these debates about what kind of history are we going to teach. The question is not, it cannot be what is true and what is not true, because we bring ourselves into it. The question has to be, who do we want to protect? Who do we want to defend? Who do we care about? What are our responsibilities to ourselves and our communities and our relationships? And I like to believe that if we sat with ourselves and had that sort of exercise, it would be a little bit less caustic.
Matthew, this question really asks if there was ever a moment that it seemed too difficult to maintain your friendship. Were there ever divides that were just too great, a line you wouldn't cross? And what'd you do?
It helped that as I mentioned, Derek and I, based on my intent, never discussed exactly what he believed. So there was never really clarity about exactly what he believed and whether or not he felt that those beliefs were changing or had changed. It was difficult. The difficulty was mostly the duration and just having to have the motivation to keep going month after month, year after year.
Thank you. Jump in when you're ready.
Well, sometimes we'll hear people say things like, we really need to respect all ideologies, or making all of them be equal. How does that land with you?
So there's different versions. Like, there is the fact that I know that white nationalist people are, in general, not evil, whatever this means. Like, the one thing that I've spent too much time in is theology, and so the concept of evil is something that's difficult. But I guess I could simplify it to, I spent so many years with people. I've seen their joys. I've seen their relationships. I've seen them cry over births and over defeats and cancer treatments and all the things that make up life. And their beliefs, with the exception of some people who really would disturb anyone, I think, but these people are very unusual within this community. They're just like anyone else. They have the same worries. They fit into any community because they're in every community. I think we have some kind of idea that people who endorse and support this white nationalist movement, who donate, who send money, who are logging on at night, are identifiable, and it's just not the case. The donations sources for the years that I was involved in my family's activism came from the population centers of America. It was not that there's some rural area where all the white nationalist support comes from. The white nationalist money came from the suburbs of Chicago. It came from the suburbs of Boston and Los Angeles and San Francisco. It came from wherever there were people. And the consequence of that is that there are white nationalists in every community, people who believe this ideology and don't see it as outside of themselves and usually don't talk about it. That I would travel the country and talk to people. I went on a road trip in between community college and going to the college where I met Matthew, where I went city to city, and I would reach out to major donors who were anonymous and private, and I would explain who I was, and I would go to dinner because I just wanted to know who everybody was, the people who didn't come to the events, the people who didn't come to conferences but still posted and sent money and support, and I met dozens and dozens of them, and they were everything. There were lawyers, there were doctors, there were people who lived in trailer homes, there were people who lived in every city in the country, and this was like a 15,000-mile road trip over several weeks. And that knowledge has to be present. Like, it's very easy to say if something is a villainous, dehumanizing ideology, it must be somebody else. And that's never the case. It's present in all our spaces because they derive their ideas from things that are present in our society, that are present in what we believe, that are present in how we alienate ourselves from other people. And so, with that caveat, I would say that their ideology is not something that we need to platform. It's not something that, to be fair, you need to bring in people who are going to give a speech about why some people are less deserving than others because of their whatever they imagine they've inherited, whatever they imagine is their culture or their biology, because that is a fundamental break in our community, as a break in our society. And I don't think that it's a violation of free speech to say that our decisions about who we're going to platform and who we're going to spread and use our resources to spread the ideas should be based in the value of our own community members and who is being harmed and who is being isolated, and taking the value of trying to make those people know that we value them and that we are not going to platform something that just makes it clear that they should not feel safe in our own spaces. And you can make the list of who these people are. It changes constantly. Who is the person who does not feel welcomed in your own community is not just some like boilerplate list in a non-discrimination law. It has many facets and many aspects, and it's people who you wouldn't necessarily recognize what they're going through and what they're experiencing, and that needs to be our value. And that's not a value that would lead you to say, well, you know, every ideology is equal and every ideology needs to be explored and put out there, because I don't think that is a value that benefits communities, and I think that should be a question. And I don't buy into the idea that in the benefit of free speech that we have to spend our resources to advocate anything. I feel like what we advocate, what we platform, what we spend our resources on does reflect our values. Mm-hmm. And so it's a value we'd be choosing if we give a roster to a white nationalist who is dehumanizing our own community. I don't think that should be controversial in a way that I think it sometimes is.
Mm. I want to ask you both about your families. I want to ask you, Derek, what your relationship is with your family now. And Matthew, I want to ask you first, as your dad watched you move through this, what did he say to you? So I'll ask you first and then ask Derek about his family.
I think he was very supportive, but it wasn't like he was getting play-by-play updates.
Yeah.
So I think he knew that I invited Derek. I think I probably mentioned it to him when I first invited him to come. And that was probably the last we spoke of, at least in great depth, for a couple of years until the thing sort of ran its course. So I think he was very supportive, but and he wasn't. Some people ask if he was worried or concerned or something. I don't think so. I mean, it was I could handle myself.
Mm-hmm. Derek, your relationship with your family, how's it changed?
When I wrote a public letter, the reaction was many days of long, very sad, very emotional conversations where they were very clear that it wasn't necessarily the case that there was a relationship to bring out of that. That I remember one point I made the case that there's all these experiences we've had. There are these things that exist outside of our advocacy for politics, our views, our how we want to change the world, how we relate. And my dad came back with saying, what in your experience tells you that our family has something binding it besides our advocacy? Like every single stage in your life has reinforced that fact. You knew what we were. It's never hid it from you. And it was not clear whether they could tolerate and handle that. It was not clear whether the relationship would continue. And I think to their credit, they decided in those days that they wanted to maintain some kind of connection. But it's always been strained. It means calling each other on holidays and birthdays. It means reaching out when something happens in the family, keeping each other updated in sort of limited, strained ways. It means like interacting sometimes in older ways, like my dad and I will discuss politics because that's the language we've always had. But it comes to a point where there's nothing more to say because we can't convince each other of anything, that we know we're not going to persuade each other of anything. And so it becomes sort of hollow at the end, that we're interested, we respect each other, we consider each other very intelligent, we consider each other somebody who can give advice, we consider each other somebody who can, who's very prescient about what is happening in a way that other people are not always, and we can get that. But the fact that we no longer have the bond of a shared view, of a shared community, of a shared connection and relationship means that can only go so far. And I don't see, neither of us see how that could change. But I think it's to their credit that they wanted to maintain a connection at all. I think that's not an obvious thing because it was so central to their life. It is so central to their life that they define themselves as being in relation with the white nationalist community that they built. And if I am outside of it, then it feels unbridgeable to them.
There's a question that, Derek, is to you, and you described white nationalists, some, as having this apocalyptic view, and if they did not act, the world would be doomed. Based in fear, it appears. And the question is, can you imagine anything that would relieve that fear?
That's a very good question.
You're in the room, raise your hand. Elaine McNulty. Why am I not surprised?
Thank you. I'm almost, it's such a good question that it's not something that I've not, a lot of these questions, it's not that I'm, giving you some rehearsed answer. I really am thinking everything through, but it's one that I'm not sure I've thought through enough to even really give an answer. And I don't want to say something like, when fear drives you, you can't get out, because I don't believe that. But it's not so easy as what could happen, because it's so nebulous. If their fear is kind of unquantifiable, that they'd go so far as to say their fear is just the absolute destruction of everything they love. And then you ask, what is that? It's not something that they can make an itemized list of here's the things that would be my fears coming true. And so it's also not the case that you can reassure them. And so it's something I'm gonna have to probably sit with, because clearly it is possible to be in some ways driven by a fear of an outcome, a fear of a harm that's going to come to you or people you care about, and to come out of that. But I'm not sure that that's the right framework, just because fear is not a motivator to change. Fear is a motivator to stay very, very still. And so it's almost like you have to solve the fear in order to create any sort of movement. So I'm not sure. It's like we could do something to solve the fear. It's like jumping a stage. Maybe it's the context. Maybe it's the space. I think it's probably that. It's probably put someone in a situation where they can build a relationship with someone who they never would have thought was important to them, and not feel judged or not feel like they're going to lose their community if they make some kind of outreach, which is a way of lessening the fear. And I don't think until you lessen the fear in that way, you can't make any sort of reconciliation or change or movement.
You've both talked about being in spaces where your worldview gets examined, not challenged, but examined. And I think I just heard you say, Derek, that the possibility of change requires that as a prerequisite. You've got to be someplace and in relationship that begins to encourage that change. So how do we move people out of bubbles? How do we move? We are more segregated now than we were at the start of the civil rights movement in the United States. Far more segregated. Our schools are more segregated. How you can be ideological in the news you watch, listen to, in the people you. What's the seismic shift that begins to move people into someone else's sphere of influence?
Well, I guess just to start, the tendency that we're seeing, I mentioned earlier, to demonize people who we disagree with makes it impossible to bridge any kind of gap or to develop any sort of common understanding. When we watch Lord of the Rings and we see these evil creatures behaving horribly, it doesn't surprise us. We're not surprised they're not trying to persuade them to behave differently, because of course that's just inherent in their nature. That's what they are. Human beings are not that. Human beings are human beings. The human beings that committed horrible atrocities and the human beings that have done unbelievable kindnesses were in many cases motivated by the same fears and hopes and dreams as everyone else in the room. What they did with those were totally different. And that's what really mattered.
There's been a rise in hate crimes over the last few years. Derek, in particular, what concerns you most about white nationalism and its nexus with contemporary politics?
I think this is a space where I get very pessimistic, because I think that, almost carrying over what Matthew is saying, that the direction of the way our politics is structured reinforces some of the worst aspects of specifically white identity. That it is that we have to, whether there's anyone in the room who doesn't accept that white identity is very potent in the United States, let me persuade you. It's not the marginal movement of white nationalism. It's something that exists in all throughout the country. It's something that exists in people who vote Democrat and people who vote Republican. It's white identity and fear that comes with that is something that is baked into all of our experiences. It is something that, it doesn't define America, but it's something that can be brutally harnessed. And that is the goal that white nationalists have, is to amplify white fear, to amplify the idea that something is lost, the idea that that people are trapped, that people have nowhere to go, that they're not a part of something that's happening in the future, that every year they're losing something that's valuable. This is something that echoes in white communities around the country, and white nationalists want to amplify. That's always been their goal for 50 years. And there are aspects of our politics that require raising fear and raising anger and raising a feeling of loss that are perfect for tapping into exactly the goals that a white nationalist has of amplifying white fear. And I get pessimistic because it's not the case that you just have this elite cabal in any aspect, not just one party or the other. It is that there is real power in creating that anger, and the way to do it, one major way to do it, is to amplify white anger and white fear. And if those things are complementary to each other, then there are many much more worse outcomes that could happen in our society than have happened yet. There are much more explicit forms of white supremacist rhetoric that you could see in mainstream politics, not even necessarily because that elected official feels them in some sort of way like a white nationalist does. It could just be a good campaign rhetoric in a way that we have not seen in many, many decades. And I think I don't have a good argument for why that can't happen. And I think I get very worried about that.
Matthew, there's a question that says, this writer says they are familiar with the concept in Al-Anon of staying in your own lane, because you can't change someone who's not ready to be changed. And there is a Jewish value to heal the world. And this person sees joined in you those two pieces, that you stayed in your own lane, and yet you describe an obligation to make sure there's not harm done to others. I think the questioner is trying to understand, does this rise out of your life as a person, a Jewish person, out of the teachings of Kabbalah? Do you see the confluence of heal the world and yet do it in a way that keeps you in your own space?
Of course, we are all obviously living our own lives and have our own backgrounds and proficiencies. But at the same time, one of the probably most fundamental aspects of my worldview is that we are all deeply, deeply connected, because we are all made in the image of the same God. That even though it looks like you and I are standing apart, at a more sublime level, where what happens to you also happens to me, and vice versa, even if you and I don't maybe realize it. So I absolutely think that it's something that stems from my belief system, because I can elaborate on anything, but it's, if I feel like everyone else is, in a sense, not really someone else, in some sense they are an extension of me, then an obligation to somebody else is tantamount to an obligation to myself. Why is this in my life, right? Why is this opportunity presenting itself to me and not to somebody else? Not in an arrogant way, not to say that I'm great or anything, but just to ask, why have I been given this opportunity and this privilege and this merit? And how can I throw that away?
And all the while knowing that it may just be to push the rock. That story is going to live with me for a long time. I just have to read this the way this is written. This is to both of you. The challenges you faced, the bravery you showed, the energy you spent, the persistence you showed. What was it that drove you? What gave you energy to go on when you didn't necessarily see the shift or you didn't know the shift was coming? Why did you persevere in this relationship?
I think for me, one of the things, which also I suppose stems from my belief system, is conviction that results don't always follow in a logical way from actions. In other words, that while my objective in my mind, right, whatever I set out to do, let's say, may not have come to fruition, that so long as I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, my efforts cannot be wasted. And they may manifest in some other way that I couldn't perceive, and maybe that I would never perceive. Like a butterfly batting its wings in China, causing a tornado in Kansas. That you can have ripple effects through your behavior that are far beyond anything that you can be aware of. And I think that is incredibly motivating, because what gets motivating is when you see nothing happening. You say, what am I doing? I'm doing all this work and nothing's happening from it. But if you can disconnect those things, effort and outcome, there's nothing to be disappointed by.
So the word amen means so be it. Everybody just say amen. This gift of not having to see the result, but doing what you're supposed to do. Period. End of story. Is that a reasonable 2 sentences?
Sure.
Sorry.
Concision has never been a strong suit of mine, so.
No, I want words that I can hold on to. What do you find inspiring about this man? What do you find inspiring about this man?
Derek is willing to turn his back on the world that he'd known for 2 decades of his life, including his family. I don't know, candidness, whether I would have been able to make the same decision that he did, given the sacrifices that entailed.
I think what I'd say about Matthew is that more so than perhaps anyone I've ever known, he has a real quality of being able to be aware and sit with deep uncertainty, and yet not be paralyzed by it. He can absorb and constantly wants to know more, and ask very deep questions about, like, what is our purpose and why are we here and what should we be doing, and yet can still make choices given that he acknowledges he just doesn't always know. You can't always know the answer, and yet you still make choices, and that's bigger than I think we often get credit for. Like the ability to know that things are uncertain and yet make important choices in your life is something that is, it's hard. I wrestle with it. I'm not good at it.
I saw you just received a question.
I did, and I love that you talked about not being paralyzed by not knowing. It's a conversation we had on our podcast episode, and I think this is maybe one of the questions that you could help us understand a little bit better with when you're overwhelmed with a moment. We are holding brave conversations, this person asks, where it says, because what is happening in this community and school district, students from different backgrounds other than white are being discriminated against, what advice can you give to us?
I mean, this is the sort of question I think I have caveats that I'm not the expert on administration in a school. I do, though, do a lot of work with organizations such as Facing History and ourselves, which produce curricula and have for almost 60 years that are intended to allow students to make choices, realize that the choices that they make have deep consequences and that their decisions always matter, by looking at the past, by trying to take them out of the moment that they're in and not just teach them some dates and facts, but to teach them that the decisions that are made at all times are individually important, and that we have responsibilities to other people, and that our decisions affect everyone that we're in community with, which in a profound way is everyone. And I think lessons like that are something that we should really make sure that we are thinking about, that we are teaching both in school but at home, that our responsibility is to other people, and that even if we find ourselves like wanting to make a change but feeling like there's nothing we can do, that's not true. It's never true. The decisions that we make at whatever age and whatever place that we're in have enormous impact in ways that we don't always see, but that we just have to have faith will matter. And so that goes for people who may be causing harm and need to be challenged, and people who feel like they're powerless. It's the same lesson.
Matthew, how about you?
I think that Derek, there's nothing I would disagree with. The only thing I might add is, what if you're the person who's being discriminated against, right? What if you're one of the kids, let's say in this scenario, although it doesn't only have to be kids, unfortunately. I think whenever we encounter these kind of situations, at least me in my own life, first of all, there's a natural instinct, right? The sort of fight or flight, and especially if there's something happening in a more physical way, as opposed to a more structural, administrative sense of discrimination, that it doesn't leave you, right? The feeling of fear and concern, it sticks with you. How you choose to direct that energy is up to you. And in the same way that Derek and these other situations were in my life, those teenagers in the Tower of Pisa were in my life for a reason too. It may not have been easy, it may not have been pleasant at the time, but they were instrumental in forging the person I later became. So, which doesn't excuse the behavior, but as opposed to being just looking at it as a victim and saying, why did this happen to me? It's, what can I take from this to further my purpose?
Is there any action that would have comforted you or made you feel supported in the moments in Italy or here or in the, as this person is asking about, kids at school? I
think one of the most important things is maybe there were 5 or 6 people in that scenario, but there were dozens or hundreds of people standing around watching everything and doing nothing. It's very easy to sort of step back and sit down and allow things to happen and to be a bystander. And I'm also involved with Facing History, and they use the word upstander, becoming an upstander.
Yeah.
There's an amazing, we were having a conversation right before this talk, and reminded me of a study that I find fascinating, which is they'll show people 3 lines, and they'll be obviously different lengths, and they'll ask them which line is the longest. And it's very obvious which, A, whatever, is the longest. But the audience has a plant, someone who is conspiring with the experimenter. And he'll say, C, and there's maybe another plant saying C. And so suddenly it comes to person, and all of the social reinforcement is flying in the face of the obvious answer, which is in front of his eyes. And the shocking thing is that almost everyone picks C, even though it's obvious that it's not right. But if the first person said A, or even just one person, the effect is removed. So the effect that we can have by standing up and speaking up for things that we see going on around us or in our communities or in our world, it doesn't just have the effect that maybe my speaking up will cause this particular situation to stop or to end, but it empowers everyone around me to intervene and to speak up in situations that they encounter.
Thank you.
The last question I was going to ask is, what can we do individually, that was asked, what can we do individually to change the hateful political environment? And Matthew, I think you just answered it. That we can use our voices for good and right as we see it, and we cannot sit silent. Because we don't know, Derek, to your point, if it will shift or not. You said to us earlier this evening, it was not necessarily logical that given these dialogues, I would make this shift. But I did. And so, beloved, as we approach 9 o'clock, let me ask you to shift in your chair again. Just shift, just get comfortable. Maybe if you're able to put both feet on the ground, and to hear this as benediction. That the ground you are connected to in this moment is holy ground. Holy means set apart for something sacred. That's all it means. It's holy ground because when you get ready to stand, you will be the only person standing on this piece of real estate. Nobody else can occupy it as you stand there. It is holy, set apart for something sacred, because as you occupy that space, you are able to fill it with good and with hope. And what we've learned tonight is that we have to do that not knowing what the outcome is going to be. Every place you stand, you have the possibility of doing good, of bringing hope. That's your rock. Push it. Don't worry about whether it moves or not. And when you're too tired to push, remember tonight and push. May you be blessed as you go into the world. Thank you, Derek and Matthew.
Thank you.
The book is on sale downstairs. The pop-up shop lives. Our guests are COVID aware, so I'm going to ask them to put their masks back on. And we will do the same. If you want to say thank you, please, but their cars leave soon. So thank you for coming. For those of you who joined us online, we say thank you.
Thank you.
And we ask you to join us next month for another courageous conversation.
Yeah.
Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.